Hello, everyone. My name is Susan Welch. I am with Proximity Malt, and we have with us today Bert Boyce from Santa Fe Brewing for our Malt in Brewing series. And this time, we're going to focus on the question of extract efficiency and the role of malt in establishing that. So real quickly, I'm just going to introduce Greg Fleehart and Matt Musial from the Proximity team.
I have this big long title that really, Bert, I'm just the maltster and a guy who turned a beer drinking habit into a career many years ago. But technically they call me the director of quality and safety, which means that 4 years ago I came out here to start up the Mid-Atlantic Malt House. I have participated in lots of different things with the Colorado Malt House that services you guys. And now I'm in charge of quality systems and safety systems for the company-wide. So it's a pleasure to meet you. My background is more brewing than malting. In 1995, I started a master's degree program at North Dakota State and have had the privilege of working in breweries or malt houses ever since.
Yeah, I was a brewer for 12 years professionally, and on the West Coast and on the East Coast. Got into a lot of different styles and fun. So I've done award-winning lagers and hazies and all that sort of fun stuff, and used Proximity for I think the last 3 or 4 years of my career. So when this opportunity came up to be a part of the team, I took it, and my back has been very, very happy.
My name is Bert Boyce. I've been a brewer for 25 years now. Studied brewing at UC Davis, California, bachelor's in brewing. Going back, graduated in 1998. So I've been worked my way through college in a brewery and have been doing this ever since, with a couple stints making wine as well. My most recent, I've been here at Santa Fe Brewing Company for 6-ish years now in the capacity of Brewmaster, which in a company our size encompasses everything. I wear a lot of hats, from project management to new product development to scheduling to employee training, hiring and firing, just basically everything that needs to be done. So my back is fine. I carry a clipboard and mostly spend my day on my computer, for better or worse. And, in terms of malting, obviously my background academically prepared me, but I would say that my greatest experience, I worked for Boston Beer prior to coming here, and really got schooled on the finer details of, what malt is, how to maximize its usage, what the levers are you can pull in terms of making the malt you want. And so fast forward, here we are now. We are probably 3 years on with Proximity, and I'll never forget the day that I first met Amy and Dale, and was really interested in the story behind what you guys were trying to do. This was in the infancy of the company. Took a trip to the Colorado Malt House while I left my wife soaking in a hot tub in Pagosa Springs. Went and checked it out, and that was all I needed to see was meet Dave and Jake and see the Malt House, and I've been a huge supporter ever since.
When I think about brewhouse efficiency and extract, I think about there is this thing that we're trying to get stuff out of that can be solubilized into water, and we want to maximize all of that stuff that gets into the water, which is malt through the mashing and lautering process, getting that soluble material into the wort, and how much of that did we start with and how much did we actually recover in the wort. And brewhouse practices on the hot side really form the basis of how we deal with that, whether it be how well our valve transitions are and we make sure we don't put any wort down the drain, to how much wort we can recover at the end at the hot wort receiver. But really what we want to focus on is at Santa Fe and in your experience, first of all, how do you look at brewhouse efficiency using those types of topics? And then I'd like to hear a little bit about your experience over time, and maybe what practices you found you had to do day in and day out to keep a handle on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're a good case study for this conversation today because we currently operate a 5-vessel fully automated Steinecker brew house that gives us control. And so I can look at COAs and figure out what we're supposed to be doing, and pretty consistent, and we can make really fine-tooth adjustments. Prior to that, we had a 4-vessel 30-barrel fully manual system, and we were actually pretty tight on that system prior to installing the Steinecker. So I do believe that our processes are pretty tight. Of course, our metrics were different. They're much better now. Our efficiency is much higher. But more important than just the number is consistency in my mind. Consistently hitting your target rather than setting a target for the moon and occasionally hitting it. It's much better in my mind to have an accurate target and hit it every time. So I think hopefully we can touch on 2 different things here today. We can get as granular and academic as we want. I don't know how beneficial that is. We can also get really practical and talk about what matters. I think there are a lot of specs on a COA that brewers are looking at. And the reality is that only a couple of them really matter to any individual brewer. To a maltster, they all matter to you, but I might pick 3, and a different brewery might pick 3, and 2 of them might be the same and one might be different. And I think it really just depends on your process and what you have control over and what you don't. So, maybe taking this from the top, what do we do and how do we think about extract recovery? First of all, I look at extract recovery at 2 different points in the process. I look at our kettle full volume and Plato. So that tells me everything I need to know about the malt, how well I milled it, how well I mashed it, and how well I lautered. And so from there, and then I also look at extract recovery in our cold wort. What do we meter into the fermenter? So those are the 2 points that I look at. I refer to one of them as lauter ton efficiency. I think in my previous stop, we called it BME. Is that right, Matt?
Yeah, BME. Yeah. And that would be the term that our previous boss used to use all the time.
BME. How many pounds of extract did you get into the kettle? That's obviously very important. That's really what we're talking about today. And then downstream of that, how many barrels at gravity did you get into your fermenter? And that's less malt related, but obviously equally important to the brewer. And then, so how do we measure that? And then what are we looking for? What are our targets here? I use coarse grind as is. That's the metric that we've settled on. It's, to me, just the most representative of the real world environment. So your maltster, our COA, the COA that we get from you guys and anyone else probably gives you any number of metrics. Might be fine grind, might be coarse grind, might be one of those plus fine coarse difference, might be moisture, might be as is. You might get 2 or 3. You might not get the one that you want or that works for your brew house. So figure out your conversions. I just have a handy little calculator that I convert over if I don't have the number that works for us. Then we quite simply put in, as part of our recipe. Our recipe is basically one big Excel sheet, and it's pounds times coarse grind extract. Gives me my potential into my barrels at gravity. That tells me what my target is for pounds of extract into my kettle full. So we'll get into that in a second. I think pounds of extract and that whole concept, kilos of extract, whether you're metric or not. And so we are currently, our BME or a lauter yield is anywhere between 95 and 99%, depending on the recipe. It's pretty good.
Those are great numbers. Yeah, those are really good numbers.
Yeah, they're good numbers. We're happy with them. There are other things that we could do. We're happy with those numbers. So, some people might use fine grind as is, and those numbers would be lower. And some people might use fine grind dry basis, and those numbers would be way lower. And so whenever a brewer asks you, what kind of yield are you getting? It's kind of, you have to start from the beginning. What metric are you using? We have to make sure we're speaking the same language. So we get anywhere between 95 and 99% coarse grind as is into the kettle. And so long as we're staying between those rails, we're pretty happy. And there are a number of factors that go into that, but I think I'll pause for a second there and see if you guys have questions or thoughts.
So the big pieces of data are how many pounds of malt did you grind, and then the kettle full barrels and Play-Doh.
Bingo.
Yeah. So that describes how much you got out of the malt. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Bert made a really good point of how you calculate it when you're talking to other brewers and they're saying, oh yeah, I got a really great extract out of it. I got, 99% extract. It was like, well, that could mean that they got, less than expected from a coarse grind as is. Or that could mean that they got almost entirely everything out of that malt they possibly could if they're using a fine grind dry basis, So I would always calculate based on fine grind as is, because that was the most readily available metric on COAs just online. So I could just go to a website and look at the malt and say, oh, it's 81% fine grind. And then I knew my brew house overall would extract about 88% of that. And so I could dial in exactly, or pretty close to what the recipe would end up being. So it's kind of a different, really how you approach it is up to the brewer and what makes more sense, and availability of data and how much work you want to do on that data. But as long as you're consistent with it, you can, you should be able to hit good numbers.
So Bert, one further question that I think, how much do you, when you're doing those day-to-day efficiency numbers and you're creating recipes, how often are you changing pounds for the same beer that you're making based upon what you're seeing on COA? Is that something you change with every silo fill, with every, truckload? How would you characterize that?
Great question, Matt. We do not proactively make changes. We get our COAs, obviously, for every trailer that comes in, and then we run it out for a week. Generally speaking, I'd say we probably make changes on a weekly basis. We get a couple reps before we make changes. So if we had more control, I'd say at the mill, frankly, brew houses have zero complaints about the brew house. Our mill is unfortunately a little undersized for our brew house, so we have had to make some concessions there. We know we're leaving some extract on the table because of the mill, and so just because the number changes a little bit, is the number within our kind of margin for error given the mill that we have? And I don't know the answer until we get about a week's worth of data. So if the guys say, yeah, I've been about a 10th low, I'll add a couple, we'll add a couple pounds. If it's been all over the place, if we're still a 10th low sometimes, we're 2/10 low sometimes, but we're dead on others, I might let that play out a little bit and see what the driving factor is. If it's friability, if it's just extract, if there's another factor that we need to be accounting for.
So the follow-up question to that then is as you've looked at improving your what you referred to as your lauter ton efficiency or your BME, and what are maybe 3 or 4 points that you've found are the ones you really have to pay attention to, either in the malt or in the brewing operations, that give you the best efficiencies?
Yep. Clearly extract, and I think I just pulled up a COA before this. I think you guys list fine coarse difference, moisture, and so from there I can get to my coarse grind as is. So that's obviously number one. Is actually really in conversations through Jake, I used to think soluble over total was a really important metric. And Jake Capron at the Colorado Malt House really taught me a thing or two about that. That is important, but it's not as important as the soluble number itself. When he looks at modification, he thinks about his soluble total or his soluble target rather than the S over T number itself. So I've started gravitating towards looking more at soluble. I'm very happy with the foam formation and head retention we have in our beers these days. So we're doing something right there. both from the malt side and on our processing side. Our formation and retention are both great. I'm very happy with that. So I watched soluble. I would say total, that kind of tells me about our enzyme package. And for our purposes, we always have more than enough. The malt is hot for us. And generally speaking, we're making pretty highly attenuated beers, pretty modern, West Coast driven, you could say, even though we're Southwest. But our beers are pretty dry, but there have been a couple of times where I've tried to run our mash hot and short and thick and see how low we can drive RDF, and I can't get it down as low as I'm used to without pulling some really crazy tricks. So there's plenty of enzyme in the package, both beta and alpha. So I never have to worry about that. We convert really quickly. I'm able to shorten our mash tun times down to pretty minimal. So the only thing then that we see that varies really when we start to have louder slowdown issues is if there's glucan issues or if there's friability issues. So we've been having friability issues recently with wheat, and our louder times have been suffering. And like everyone else, we're making a lot of hazy IPA and adjunct-driven beers now, and our louder times are all over the place. So really, it's more a milling issue. Well, it's learning how to mill this malt that we're using so much more of, rather than just as an accent. It's a major part of our grist. So I'd say friability is important, and then if we see a glucan swing, pretty quickly pick up the phone and call Jake, and he'll let me know if this is a big picture issue or just a blip, and he's got it under control for starting next week.
That sounds great. That was a great explanation. Thank you.
The basics, the top 5.
The beta glucans get a lot of attention, and we could spend another couple hours talking about how that beta glucan number is derived and what it really means coming out of the lab. But because a lot of people get that cut off, sometimes it gets a lot of attention. But you mentioned friability. What has your experience been with friability, both on the high side and on the low side in what you see in your brewhouse efficiencies?
I would say, again, it depends, again, like every brewery and brewer, it depends on your equipment. And again, it goes back to our mill for us. So our mill is undersized, which means that in order to keep up with our brewhouse cycle times, which are pretty short, we have the brewhouse tight, but it means that the mill has to run at near capacity. And so the issues that we see because of that are, it's a 4-roller mill with no sieves, so it's a straight pass through, and we don't have automated gap settings. So it's a Kunzel. It's great. It's a great mill. It's just, I think, too small. So to compensate for that, we run the upper pair pretty loose, and we run the bottom pair pretty tight. I would love to be able to tighten up the upper pair and loosen up the lower pair, but I can't, or I lose too much throughput. So what happens then is when friability is high, is because that lower gap is pretty tight, we are just turning malt into powder if friability is too high. It does not retain starch granules. It just powders, and then we see extended louder times. So that's been the practical problem, or practical application for us. If we could, and we probably will have to pretty soon, we'll try this, is going back and lowering that, or increasing the gap on the lower pair of rollers to see if we can hold on to a little larger granule, and then that might help. It might help us in the louder.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is kind of maybe a side note. So our last brew I was working at had a 4-roller rad mill, and something unique I think to that mill was you had the ability to control the flexibility of the rollers. So we were able to take the top 2 rollers and make them a little more flexible. So when and move them apart. So it was more of a gentle squeeze. So when there was a lot of malt coming through it, they moved apart a little bit. And so we were able to kind of squeeze that kernel out of the husk. And then that second one, we can have a little more rigid and a little tighter to really like grind the kernel itself. So that was a really nice feature that I haven't seen on too many mills, but I'm hoping it kind of catches on because you could really fine tune that crush, even just with the pressure, rather than just the gap.
Yeah. So you're saying, so you've got your gap setting here, you've got your position of the roller itself, and then the springs that hold it there, and you could adjust the spring tension.
Exactly.
You could lower the spring tension, allow it to float a little more, even though home was 1 millimeter or whatever.
Exactly.
Cool. No,
It just it allows for a little more. Kernel size is usually pretty uniform. But if there's just minor details, it's really going to get a similar crush through all those kernels because it's just a little bit more give, especially on that top one. You want more of a gentle squeeze rather than a crush. And then that bottom one is really getting that kernel opened up. It's kind of a cool feature. So hopefully people continue to make that happen for future mills.
I have a question. What do you think are some of, or maybe the biggest misconception about brewhouse efficiency? Is there something out there that you sort of see time and again that you just kind of think, oh man, I wish people would get their heads around that?
Well, for the small brewer, I think everyone assumes that they should be getting 100% efficiency all the time. And that's, just not practical, and you're not going to be able to consistently have that be in your brew house. I think the other, knowing how to calculate it, I think is something that we just talked about, and what your metrics are. And total brew house efficiency versus your BME is different. So if your evaporation rate on your kettle is really, really high, you're going to look like you have better extract efficiency because you're just boiling off water. But if you have a really low evaporation rate, you're going to say, well, my extract efficiency isn't that great. But it's like, well, it is. Your extract efficiency is actually pretty high, but your just boil off rate, so your total efficiency for your brew house is really not great. So it's a lot of different metrics that play around. I think the brewers that I've come to know that are really good at and really consistent brewers, they found their own kind of way to calculate this and know what their consistencies are and where they need to improve on them, rather than sticking to some weird standard of like, I got to get 100% efficiency, so I got to grind this malt as tight as possible and just turn it to powder. And then they're constantly wondering why they're getting stuck mashes and low extract efficiency. So that happens a lot too, especially on smaller systems. You actually want to really coarse grind with modern malts, and you're going to get a more consistent and better extract. Even when you have a 5 Plato wort, which is hardly ever happens, all the way to like a 20 Plato wort, you're going to see a more consistent extract number throughout that range.
Greg, that leads into a really good topic there. And I think I'll pose the first question to you. Your experience as a brewer, how did you look at grist size, grist particle size distribution? What's maybe best practice that is easy and something you can do on a day in and day out basis?
Bert probably is familiar with this method too, but it's basically, for better or worse, called the Van Havig method. So he published a paper. He was the director of quality, kind of the overseeing quality director for the Rock Bottom chain, and now he's founded Gigantic Brewing. He had dozens and dozens of brew houses across the country. So he took all of them and said, hey, let's brew this exact same recipe, record all of your extract efficiencies. They were all the same brew house. And he took all these different things and took a look at all the metrics. And what he found was that the grind was the biggest factor in extract efficiency. And that if you have 70% of your grist above a size 14 sieve, that's the optimum, and it didn't really matter what was below it. That kind of didn't affect the extract efficiency. And this is for single infusions, smaller brew houses that are not necessarily having mash mixers or mash filters. Obviously, are a whole different beast. But he found that made the most difference between all of his breweries. So my approach was that. So getting that grist 70% above size 14, and then just time and seeing what the system liked. Because every brew house, we were operating 2 brew houses, exact same manufacturer, same specs. One was a 7 barrel, one was a 10. and they needed slightly different grinds to get the best extract efficiency. And then visually looking at it, seeing what your grist spent grain looks like, your ladder times, ladder efficiencies, and really just dialing in for what works for your system, because it's kind of a living, breathing thing. It needs its own attention to detail and care.
I agree. We currently use a 6 sieve set on a shaker. I think the whole thing was about $1,000. So you can do the math and figure out if that's going to pay for itself in your brewery or not. Prior to buying that, we called it the Frisbee method, which is we'd throw a Frisbee underneath the discharge of the mill, and brewers would look to make sure that it looked right. And Greg, to your point, most of the time when it didn't look right, it was too fine. And so for our old brew house, if things were too fine, then you start seeing too much variation in your lauter time or your runoff time or whatever, if it's a single infusion mash tun. And that's the biggest issue, I think, is it's just inconsistency. So getting back to the idea that you started with, that some brewers are targeting 100%. They'll do everything they can to try and get that 100%. But then one day that beer may take 2 hours to run off, and one day it may take 4. That is not the same beer. I guarantee you it's not the same beer. You're better off, much better off, lowering your expectations, lowering your target, making the beer easier to run off more consistently. Leave a couple pennies on the table, but run that beer off every time in an hour and a half or an hour and 45. You long term, that's a much better way to go about the process. And I think about it as a process that has to be consistent. The first thing you need to do as a brewer, and we're production breweries and we make the same beers all the time, so it's our mindset, and it's really easy for me to say this, but our focus is on setting achievable goals and then making sure that our process supports achieving that target every time. As soon as you start setting unachievable goals, your process starts deviating, and now you're not making the same beer every time. So that's what's really important to us. And so, on the note of like the 100% idea, going way back in the day, brewers didn't care what extract they got because they figured their margins were so great that they didn't care if they got 50% yield. And that obviously has changed as well. I'm glad as an industry that's grown up and we're no longer looking at it that way. But I mean, that's great if you've got money to burn. But the problem with that approach is some days you're going to get 50 and some days you're going to get 75. And again, you're not making the same beer every time. And that's the goal. So set a goal, pick a number, design your process around achieving a reasonable target, and then just do that. To me, that's what quality is doing what you say you're going to do and doing it every time.
That's a really good point, Bert. Back a little bit to your particle size distribution measurements. What have you found is the right, how often do you do that test to make sure that you stay in control?
That was the one thing that I couldn't find great data on before this call this morning. When we were commissioning the Steinecker, we pulled out all the literature for all the particle size distribution. We settled on the Kunze distribution as being the most relevant to ours with a modern lauter ton. And we said, cool, these are the numbers. And then we did our best to get that grind in our during commissioning, and nothing was working out. The beer wasn't working correctly. And what we found was that, again, it's our throughput. It's related to our throughput issues in the mill. So again, we have to run our upper gaps really wider than we'd like and our lower tighter than we'd like. So we have our grist distribution is heavy on powder and heavy on whole husk. We don't have much in the middle. So it's not a classic grist composition by any stretch. If we could do a number of things, slow down, had a bigger mill, had a 6-roller, any number of things that allowed us to be easier on the mill instead of running it at near capacity, our particle size distribution would probably look more like a normal or classic curve, but it just doesn't. But so to answer your question, what we've determined anecdotally what works for us, and we check it every Friday. So right now we run 4 days. Monday through Thursday, and then Friday is CIP and maintenance mostly on the malt handling side. It's all chain disc, and it's pretty sketchy when those things fail. And so we've learned that we need to maintain them every week, or at least check tensions on chains and discs and check our grist weekly. So we know it, and unfortunately, I wish I had those numbers in front of me. I don't know what our current distribution is. I will tell you it's heavier on the large and small end, and very thin in the middle relative to the classic curve, though.
Oh, that makes sense.
Bert, how often do you see that particle size distribution, your grist, how often do you see it wander in that week period? Is it usually pretty dead on, or are you having to make adjustments every week?
No, it's usually pretty dead on. They hardly ever change.
Okay.
So yeah, we don't see that our previous mill, actually, this is when we got really good. The previous mill that we had in our old 30, which I won't name names, but we hated that mill. And that drifted constantly. And so guys were running, they were running grist analysis, multiple times during the week, and brewers were making constant adjustments to it. And so back in the day when I first started talking with you guys, and we were trying to provide as much data for you as we could, I just couldn't give you data that I was confident in, because our mill was drifting and our brew house was very manual. So I couldn't tell you if the problem was on your end or ours. But now I can say with confidence that I know that our process is tight. The mill isn't perfect, and that's pretty much the only variable we're looking at now. Before we were around the clock 5 days a week, so we were doing 6 brews a day, 4.5, 5 days a week. We were cranking. We were at like 30,000 barrels on a 30-barrel brew house. Yeah, our turn times were fast. Our brewers are good, but unfortunately, the piece of crap mill we had before required constant attention. What's
the role of modification in both extract efficiency and lauter time? And how are we as a company, as Proximity, approaching that? And if we're doing something a little bit differently than maybe some other domestic suppliers or international suppliers. So what's our kind of philosophy in modification? How does that affect extract efficiency?
Traditionally, we focus on lower protein barleys should be able to give us a better opportunity to modify the protein that is there into something that releases the extract a little more freely. So at Proximity Malt, we focused on barley varieties that yield low protein time and time again. Something definitely less than 11, and in many cases less than 10, so that the kernel has the opportunity to put more of its energy into the carbohydrates portions of that. And meanwhile, that protein matrix makes up a lot of the cell walls and in the internals to the endosperm. So the lesser amount of that, the better off we can make that freer flowing. Now, how in the malting process do we actually do that? And we don't go to kiln until we get a certain amount of friability in the malt to ensure that it's modified properly for people like Bert the brewer. So that's one of the ways that we do it. And one of the philosophies that we have of malting at Proximity is to make sure that we have the right level of friability prior to going to kiln.
And if I could tack something on there, because I really learned a lot about what to look for when measuring modification and what a good level of modification is. For those that don't know, I was fortunate enough to be at the beginning of the process for the production of the Proximity Pils malt, being right down the road and a heavy user. And Jake and Dustin and I spent a lot of time on the phone about what the results we were seeing and what we expected. And we were using a European Pilsner malt that shall remain unnamed. And I had certain preconceived notions about what that malt was and what the numbers on it looked like. And when you guys were starting to produce Pils malt, I gave Jake, well, I think these are the specs. This is what, I think we would like to be working with. And he's trying to make this malt, and it's just not working. It's not working in the brew house. It's not working in the malt house. It doesn't taste right. So finally, I send him a sample of the malt we were working with. And this malt that's advertised as classic European under-modified Pils malt is not. It's highly modified. It's a very modern, probably made in a GKV, probably basically what we're looking at now is just a different barley. I'm sure there's some tweaks, but as soon as we came to that realization that, the S over T on this malt is not as low as we thought. And that's when Jake drove home the idea that I don't really care what the S over T is, so long as our starting total protein is low enough. What I care about is soluble protein. I think that's what you care about. That's when I let go of this idea that this malt has to be under modified, which is very lowly modified. Sure enough, that's what did it. When I, as a brewer, let go of this preconceived notion of the malt that I thought I wanted based on what I've read and everything else, and then the malt, the Proximity Pils malt, ultimately landed on a pretty modern. It's a different. Correct me if I'm wrong. There's a different barley assortment or sorting process. And you set aside certain lower protein malt, but at the end of the day, the process isn't that different from base to row, and it performs beautifully and it tastes different. It produces lower color. It's got that Pils malt, classic Pils malt character, but it's easy to work with, and that's everyone wins. As soon as we came to that realization, it's a win-win for you and for us as a brewer, and that really opened my eyes to what I thought I knew versus what I actually know.
Greg, how have you found in your workings with your customers how they look at this Brewhouse Efficiency, and if we could give one suggestion, what's the one suggestion we do time and time again?
You really should be checking your grist for that distribution when you're moving between malts. So you really should be doing that every time. And we do tell people, check your grist, make sure it's where it needs to be before you start. So run it through your mill, just a handful or a pound or two, see what it looks like, dial it in, and then go ahead and try to brew a batch with it. Because it is a nice friable, low protein variety. It can powder up if you're not careful. I think that's true with something along the lines of like pale ale too, like a British pale ale, that tends to be highly modified and can turn to powder in an instant. So you really do have to be careful all the time when you're milling and when you're using new malt to you, for sure.
And I think I'm glad you guys are putting things together like this to try and either give people guidance or motivation, or we can point them towards tools that are available so that we know what we're doing, we know what we're trying to do before we ever even start. And I think that's everything here. Know what the tools you have, know what your ingredients and your materials are, know what the flavor profile for the beer you're going for is. Shoot for the moon. You will be disappointed, but at least you know what you did wrong, and you'll try it again next time, and hopefully next time the beer will be better.
Bert, quick question. When you're calculating your load on your screen, is that wet weight or is that just dry weight? Is that include the water? Okay, just the dry. Gotcha.
Yeah, that gives me a sense of my bed depth.
To that point, when I was working at a friend's brewery for about a year, just as a kind of a temporary stopgap for him, Bainbridge Island Brewing Company in beautiful Bainbridge Island, Seattle, which Susan, you're not too far from there. Fantastic brewer, was making great beers, but we were really having trouble as a team just with consistency and extract efficiency and mash pH. And we couldn't really figure out what was going on. So when I took over, Russell, the brewmaster there, he's extremely talented in terms of research and development, and is always willing to try new things. So we installed a flow meter and started dialing in our flow on our mash tun, and found the ratio that worked beautifully for that mash tun. And we started hitting extract efficiencies on the dot every single time, and our mash pH was on the dot every single time, because we did not have gallons and gallons extra worth of water diluting the buffers that we were putting in there for the pH, or vice versa. So yeah, I think that's something I totally forgot about, but having a consistent mash liquor to grist ratio and knowing what works the best on your system and for the load that you're putting on that screen. So obviously if you're a little bit lower, you can be a little higher. If you're a little higher, it's better to be a little bit thicker, so you're not putting as much pressure on that screen. But it really did help and has helped in the future for all my brewing after that, of dialing in and really making consistent pHs and consistent extract efficiencies.
Yeah, completely agree. When I talk about water balance, yeah, that assumes, a flow meter, a simple turbine flow meter is what, $300.
Yeah.
Flow meter on your water supply side and your mash tun, and a flow meter on your wort outlet. Both, neither one of them are very expensive, and they will both pay for themselves, even in a fully otherwise manual brew house. Knowing how much water you're putting in and knowing how fast you're running off will ensure that you're doing the same thing every time. For any given recipe, you start at 15 gallons a minute, or let's say you start at 7 gallons a minute, and then you go to 10, and then you go to 15 on your runoff. Like, once you've dialed that in, you're golden. Same amount of water, same amount of malt, same runoff speed every time, same beer every time.
Yeah. And you can use if you don't have a way to do it on the wort out, which you obviously should try to invest in. But if you just have it on your water supply side, you can look at your sparge speed. So how fast your sparge water is coming out, and how far that bed is. If it's staying really consistent, you can match that and say, oh, it looks like I'm actually drawing off 10 gallons a minute. So you can kind of get an idea of what your flow speeds are. And then also you just take kettle measurements as you're running off, and then time it and say every 15 minutes. So my brew sheets were like every 15 minutes, what's my kettle volume? What's the wort Play-Doh in the kettle? Well, what's my total volume of sparge water? And just having all those metrics really helps, especially a new brew house. When you're commissioning a new brew house, having as much points of data as you possibly can. And then you can really dial in what works and what doesn't.
I think that's a great note to end on. You guys kind of saved one of the best tidbits for last. I think that's really an interesting dialogue around the importance of measurements from the very beginning. I would like to wrap it up a little bit. I want to thank Greg and Matt for joining us, but especially Bert for sharing your knowledge, your daily knowledge around the topic of extract efficiency.
Thanks to Bert for coming to do this. It's great. Always great to talk to another brewer, and I learned actually quite a bit. So it's always great to learn a little bit and have someone share some knowledge. So appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Bert, for joining us. Do appreciate all of your bits of knowledge there, and thinking about that lauter ton loading per square meter. That's a new one for me to really think about, and as you get in those big high gravity beers, something to consider. So yeah, thank you for your time, and thanks for being a great supporter and teaming up with Proximity Malt.
Again, I'll say thank you guys for doing what you do. To me, you've changed the game. You brought local and craft to the table, to a brewery our size, but also the consistency and quality that I expect from a larger supplier. To me, you guys you're the perfect combination of access and focus on customer, as well as quality and consistency built into your product, from the very top of the organization all the way through. And I'm just honored to be a part of all of this with you guys. I consider this a true partnership, and I thank you guys for doing what you do.